and welcome to this gender research, gender wars roundtable. So we will try to make it a little bit shorter than we planned, not to make you starve, because lunch is right after. And so this panel, it's a roundtable, so we really hope for your participation. We'll have some initial thoughts. In this roundtable, we are trying to think about how we can use anthropological research in order to address what's going on in what we call gender wars. The conflicts around gender and sexuality, which we have been witnessing for the last 10 or so years, but lately it became a really vivid topic with Donald Trump, issuing his executive order on defending women from gender ideology extremism and restoring biological truth to the federal government. So on this really high up level, I think gender wars are really kind of in the center of today's politics. And so let me start with introducing our panelists. So Francis Pine, who I think doesn't need any introduction. Every time I go to the UK, everybody I meet are either Francis's students or PhD students, or she was on the committee, and here in Poland, everybody read her work on Górale or on Łódź and so on. So let me just say that she has been conducting fieldwork in Poland since the 70s, and she focused mostly on gender and kinship, and she's now reader emeritus at Anthropology department in Goldsmiths. And her latest book is Intimacy and Mobility in the Area of Hardening Borders, Gender Reproduction Regulation, co-edited with Haldis Haukanes, and I think we'll refer a lot to this work. And then our other panelist is Nicolette. We call her Makovicky, but she introduces herself Makovicky, who's associate professor and director of Russian and Eastern European Studies at the University of Oxford, and she's been also working on Poland and on Slovakia, on labor, informal economy, craft, and gender. And her latest publication is Making Place After Socialism, Creativity, Gender, and the Politics of the Commons, which just came out in East European Politics and Societies and Cultures, right? That's a few weeks ago. And our last panelist is Agnieszka Kosiorowska, Rall, who's a PhD student here working under my supervision, and her dissertation is on gender, religion, and migration, and her latest publication is Negotiating Moral Regime, Polish Catholics' Changing Attitudes Towards Catholic Sexual Ethics, which just appeared in Social Compass just a few weeks ago. More than days now. Yes, and my name is Agnieszka Kościańska. I'm a professor of anthropology, professor of the humanities is the official title here in Warsaw. And my latest book is this one. It's the Routledge Handbook of Sexuality in East Central Europe, which I co-edited with Anita Kulimaj, Katarzyna Liszkowa, and Hanli Rankin, who I wanted to mention because they are also in spirit, in a way, in this part of this panel. And this panel grows in the spirit of the title of our conference of Togetherness, Relational Knowledge and Solidarity. So this panel grows from years of collaborations between us and also with other people like Hadley or Katarzyna, but the latest thing we did together, all of us, was this research project, Gender Wars East and South, which Nicolette was the PI, I was international co-PI, and both Agnieszka and Francis took part in various our events, either in Oxford or here in Warsaw. And Gender Wars was this project which was interdisciplinary, transnational, and also intergenerational. So we also want this panel to be kind of intergenerational panel of gender researchers. So, as this is a roundtable, we will have 2 rounds of roundtable intervention. So, in the first round, we will just talk a little. We will try to map the anthropology of gender, but we will do it not in like a academic kind of fashion, but more in a personal fashion. We will just reflect on what kind of questions and what kind of collaborations build our own gendered anthropology. So that will be also, I think, in the spirit of the conference title, Togetherness, Solidarity, and Relational Knowledge. So collaborations and inspirations within the panel and within this room and more broadly. So, Francis, do you want to go first as the oldest in this intergenerational, the most senior, in this intergenerational.
The oldest.
We were all your students. So.
Does this work? Okay. Thank you. Thank you for inviting me to do this. I've been thinking a lot about this in relation to the idea of gender wars. And I was thinking, how did we get here from when I was studying as an undergraduate, the first two really important volumes on sex roles and women came out. And I remember TA coming and bringing me back papers from the AAA meetings from what became Women, Culture and Society, and what became Toward an Anthropology of Women. And I was incredibly excited. And it was really inspirational work because there'd been such a silence around women in anthropological research. And if you were a student, you were very aware of that because you were reading and the women do the cooking kind of thing, and the women have the babies. And this was a completely different way of looking at it. And I think the really important ideas that came out of that became the sort of binaries that, referring back to the last panel, that really dominated gender studies, only it wasn't called that yet, and anthropological research were ideas about production and reproduction, households inside and outside, public worlds and domestic worlds, and nature, culture, women, culture, men, very much leaning on Simone de Beauvoir, and then a very strong stream of Marxist anthropology that picked up production and reproduction, but in a different way, more sort of through Marx and Engels. So I went to do my PhD in London, and I went off to Poland I wanted to look at women and labour and property, inheritance. I wanted to look at women in peasant farming households in a socialist country, but with private land. And that was sort of a big ask. And the Podhale was a very logical place to do it. During that time, it was really, really clear to me that a whole lot of the things that I'd been reading about and that I was really inspired by didn't happen that way in the Podhale. And I was very struck by how very vocal and active and present women were in the economy, in management of all sorts. So I started to rethink things. And I got back to the UK, and everything had moved from women and sex roles and an anthropology of women to gender. And I got very excited about this. This was very much the beginning of works by Marilyn Strathern, particularly, which really insisted that gender is a relational subject. We've got to look at the articulation of different worlds and how they're expressed differently, how they're known consciously and unconsciously in different social, economic, historical contexts. And so I think it was a real game changer, and I think it was just as inspirational as the first round from the early 70s was. And I guess what I wanted to think of from there is how after really a couple of decades of a lot of work on gender, showing that you can't think about kinship, you can't think about politics, you can't think about religion without connecting them to gender too. It's in place, in space, and everything. That it's a very strong symbolic as well as practical category. Joan Scott talks about it as she says, gender is a very useful analytical concept, and I think that's really true. So how do we get to that, from that, to the position that we're in now, where we have something that we're calling gender wars, and gender has become a completely politicized word with a completely different meaning when it's seen in terms of the general attack on what is seen as woke politics, when it's seen in terms of relation of sexuality, of very, very much of women as the bearers of culture, but through reproduction, not through public high-profile things, and very much through the idea of a very strong natural family, very essential bodies, and a dominant masculinity, very toxic masculinity often. How does that come about? And I think there are all sorts of ways that we can look at it through this, but I think that it's really important to make those connections, to say that there are new borders and boundaries being written and really carved out in the world all the time at the moment, and it's very much in terms of a lot of things came up in the last panel, and I think they'll keep coming up, of the things that are seen as crises at the moment, as threatening, of like migration, like climate change, like shifting sexuality that people perhaps don't understand, like economic crisis. And there are systems of inequality, and somehow gender's been, I feel like it's been hijacked to be a kind of concept that can be used by people who want to return to a much more essentialist view of women and men, of natural families, and then extending out from there to the idea of who belongs here, who do we need to keep out from here, how do we justify these systems of inequality which are emerging more and more by saying they're right, they're correct, because this is the right order. How do we understand these relations in terms of the individual, the family, the state, the church, and how does gender become the main player in that? So that's my trajectory.
Yes, and I think you already started the discussion around gender wars. No, but that's good. Okay, so let me now say a few words about my way to anthropology of gender. So my first encounter with anthropology of gender was a little bit later than in the case of Francis. That was in the 1990s. When I was an exchange student in Copenhagen, I studied at the anthropology department, and I was really hoping to have a class with Kirsten Hasker, but she was on sabbatical and interested. But then Judith Oakley was a visiting professor there, I'm assuming replacing for you. And then she taught this class, Anthropology of Europe, during which we read Michael Hertzfeld's work on masculinity and a lot of gender anthropology. And also Judith talked a lot on British academia and all those constraints in the development of both gender and the position of women within the academia. And then I was thinking during this class, coming from Poland, that well, this is super interesting on the one hand, but on the other hand, it doesn't really fit in the experience we have here with, first of all, communist emancipation of women, and also various traditions of the Polish mother within the Polish nationalism of the 19th century. So I was thinking that this is really, there are a lot of tensions between what's going on there in the West and here in the East, and perhaps we as the East are a little bit similar to Southern Europe because they were with Catholicism and more religion, but not quite. And then also academically, as you can see, the founder of our department, the founder of anthropology here in Warsaw, was Cezaria Bodłam de Courtenay Ehrenkreuz Jędrzejewiczowa, who was one of the first female professors in Poland and also globally already in the 1930s. And I think thanks to her there was this strong tradition of female presence in the Polish academia, but also within anthropology itself. So we had a lot of Polish professors, and then I know Magdalena Zowczak, with whom I did my PhD, but also other women who make space for female researchers. So I thought it was quite different from the experience in the UK. Then in the early 2000s, I met Francis, and then all those pieces were I managed to put together thanks to our ongoing conversation, because thanks to all your work and all those discussions we have, I managed to understand how important it is to localize and to historize gender, and also to put it together with kinship and the central role of the family here in Poland, and the central role of the family for thinking about the nation. And this is like exactly in one of the Francis's texts on the Rall wedding, when she's showing that how in the 1990s, everything changed, but if you look a little bit deeper, then the family just stays there in the center. So I thought it was like, for me, also very important perspective that allowed me to continue my work on sexuality and sex education, or expert knowledge of sexuality, and more recently on xenophobia and racism. And then all this concept of family, it seems to be crucial to all of that. So I think I stop here and talk about gender wars in a second, and then Nicolette want to say a few words about your connection to gender, because you are not such a classical gender scholar.
No, I'm not.
But you are now.
But I am now. So that's how I was gonna start talking about. And what I'm going to do is, rather than talk about sort of my own history, throw out a bunch of questions, because I have done field work with crafts women, in particular, for 20 years in Slovakia and here in Poland. In many ways, I feel like I've gone a little bit in Francis's footsteps. So Francis was my thesis examiner, or one of them, and that my thesis was on craftswomen in Slovakia, and then subsequently I stumbled upon an exciting field site in Poland, and so I feel like I sort of followed Francis's footsteps, and then did work in Poland, also with craftswomen doing textile crafts. And throughout this period, I've always focused my publications, and most of my theoretical interest has been in economic anthropology, it's been around craft, it's been around heritage, but gender has always been following naturally out of what I've been doing, and I've written a lot about domestic economies and so on. So it's been the ghost in the background, always, and always formed my thoughts. Recently, I published an article, which was not the one that you mentioned, which is, by the way, the first article I've written where gender is in the title, finally. It took me 20 years to get there. I published another article which was called How to Make a Socialist Doily, which is about making and what I call amateur folk arts. So the encouragement under socialism in Slovakia to get ordinary citizens to get involved in making folk art, not just kind of craftspeople and so on, but everyone. And what I thought the article was about an alternative kind of modernity that was being presented to the public. And this alternative modernity was a modernity where materials were your partners and objects were your friends. And that making and being homo faber as a socialist citizen is part of being a good socialist citizen. But my example was all around embroidery, and the way women's magazines were encouraging women to make folk embroidery. And one of my reviews that I got back on this article said, you're writing this article as if, you're writing about the universal man. Basically saying you haven't acknowledged gender enough, even though I did sort of, say that, these things are gendered, men were encouraged to do other kinds of crafts, women were encouraged to do this was the material I had, so, and this got me thinking I mean, I don't think the reviewer didn't have a point. They had a point, and I strengthened this sort of thinking about gender. But it got me thinking about a whole different bunch of things, which kind of could be put under, you know, what is it good for? The thinking, the theoretical perspective of gender, what is it good for? What can we do with it? And my first thought when I read this, this comment in the review was, well, you know, hasn't the story already been told? Women embroider, women are socialized through learning textile crafts, etc. You know, there's a vast Marxist literature on analyzing domestic economies and how women work within domestic economies, how craft and textile work allows them to work without going beyond some of these gendered borders and so on. And sort of, I thought, you know, if I want to tell this story again, then how should I tell it? And I think maybe this other article that you mentioned is about retelling that story, but in a different way. And the second thought I had was, if I'm being criticized, you know, for writing as if women are the universal man, well, what about the universal woman then? Not in a sense that all women are the same, but why is it that somehow there's an assumption I cannot say something about socialist citizenship outside of a gendered frame, that I cannot contribute with something more general, that because I'm writing about female crafts and women thereby, somehow that excludes me and I need to qualify what I say. And doesn't that just kind of reinforce this idea that the male perspective is the dominant one? So that was another thing. And then, you know, thinking about, you know, if we're always qualifying women's experience as gendered female, you know, what other discussions are we missing? We're perhaps missing what Eva was talking about, which is body and matter, and in ontologies and knowledge, stories about making and meaning. Are those necessarily always gendered, or is there something more to be said? And also things like unfashionable themes like class, I think, which need to be taken into account, and which, of course, are intersectional with gender, but, you know, so basically it really got me thinking. I have no answers for these questions, but it got me thinking about, you know, what is it that we can say with gender? How is it useful to us as anthropologists, as a lens? And I think it is. But I haven't solved these. I just wanted to throw them out for discussion.
So before I hand it over to Agnieszka, I just want to comment on what you said on this perfect, you know, proper socialist citizen, that it cannot be woman. But I mean, in the eyes of the reviewer, which is interesting also in the sense that as we can now see, and that, you know, the women's emancipation was one of the major socialist goals, which went quite well in comparison to other things. So and especially that there should be space for this kind of presentation. Okay, Agnieszka, you want to say something?
So my interest in gender, well, it happened largely through Agnieszka actually. I was in her master's seminar. I studied in this institute, so the Institute of Ethnology and Cultural Anthropology of Warsaw. Does it work? Can you hear me? Okay,
Yes,
that's perfect. Yeah, I studied in this institute, and I actually my first encounter with anthropology was through Amanda and her ethnographic laboratory, from which I derived an interest in expert knowledge. And then when I came to Agnieszka's seminar, and then I went from my Erasmus to École d'Institut en Sciences Sociales in France. I started looking for something to combine, you know, this interest in expert knowledge and in gender, and I started talking to Polish migrant women, and they were telling me about how they socialize their children into being bilingual, and I realized that there's like loads of literature about bilingualism that is written from this psychological perspective, but not really any interest in these women who devote their time, sometimes enormous amounts of time, to you know, producing little geniuses or little poles, and sometimes it's kind of the same thing. And I started being interested in how they use this expert knowledge and how and why do they actually do this. And I started looking at it as, you know, unpaid women's work. So that was like my first project related to gender. And then, you know, Catherep project happened. So the project called Catholicized Reproduction, Reproducing Catholicism, Activist Practices and Intimate Negotiations in Poland, 1930 present. I never learned to say it without reading.
Sorry.
The entire 3 years of the project. But this project got me started on Catholicism, and it is also related to my PhD thesis, which focuses on similar issues but among Polish migrants living in France. So first I did this research here in Poland about like how Catholicism connects to the issues of reproduction and sexuality, and then I wanted to see what changes in migrant settings about these things. And for me the most fascinating thing about Catherep was that it actually started in 2020, so during the pandemic, and then suddenly the strike COVID, the women's strike happened. So we were able to actually see how people's attitudes evolved during the pandemic, during the lockdowns, when they are kind of disconnected from the church, and then how these issues related to sexuality and reproduction are like animating, inspiring people to take a voice on a very political matter, and how these protests were about abortion, but they were also about the church and state-church relations, and they were also about the government, about the shape of the Polish state. It was extremely interesting to see in interviews how these involvements, they evolved from some kind of like from personal biographies, and from some kind of anger against the church and against how hard it is to combine one's religion with the realities of a sexual, intimate life. So this is what I did during the Catherep project. And then on the other hand, within migrant settings, I was like trying to see kind of for the classical migrant studies approaches, how it changes. What happens to what we have here when people migrate. And then recently I've been realizing that it doesn't work like that, because the situation, like in order to think about it this way, you'd have to imagine that the situation in Poland is not changing at all, while it's extremely dynamic. So I'm trying to see how these issues are actually very similar, and then these transformations that happen within migrant settings and the tools of migrant studies actually help us understand also how things change in Poland. Because what happened during COVID, for instance, is a very similar thing that happens for people when they migrated and they no longer have the same routines they used to have before leaving. And then lately my interest shifted from political mobilizations towards more like personal decisions about sexuality and family making, and how these things happen under neoliberalism, and how they are connected to like different global discourses about gender and about sexuality, and how they are also like impacting political changes.
Thank you. So that brings us to our second question on what we do, how this kind of gender anthropology can help us to understand the gender wars. Because I was thinking, first in Poland, the whole public debate around gender, so-called gender ideology, started in 2013 with this sudden explosion of articles, bishops' statements, Polish bishops talking about Judith Butler, and it all started in 2013. And I had this thought, is this my fault? Because back in 2007, me and a colleague, Renata Chryciuk, published a book, Gender, Perspektywa Antropologiczna, Gender and Anthropological Perspective, which was a reader of, classical texts, not only classical, but classical and more or less less classical text in anthropology of gender. We also had, Francis's text there. And then I thought maybe this is the us feminists put this foreign term into debate and people don't understand it. But then I figured, no, this is not our fault. This is like global dynamic. But then let us, before we open up for the audience, let us just maybe reflect for a second. What is about the very term gender that it provokes this kind of reactions and usage, and how we as anthropologists through our research could contribute to better understanding of those political conflicts that we have here. Francis, do you want to go first?
I think that one of the things about the word gender is that within anthropology, as well as in a more general outside public world, you have people, most of the anthropologists who work on gender insist on the fact that this is looking at things relationally, and that's what it has to be. But it also became a euphemism almost, or a different way of saying we're talking about women. So if you did a gender course, it had to be a women's course, or if you did. So in a way, gender was the wider concept of gender, which is a really useful one because it allows you to look at all of these different levels of interaction and the things that stay the same and how things change, and this whole thing of what people know in an embodied sense and what they know because it's something that they've learned, or something that's spoken of very clearly in terms of ideology or doctrine or whatever. But that because the nuances of gendered work somehow got lost, I think, and it became another way of saying women. And woman is, I think, a very, very easy symbol to pick up on and use. And so you say, okay, all of these things are coming out of this thing called the anthropology of gender. And they're looking at different sexualities, at trans, looking at migrants' worlds, looking at a whole range of things which were in terms of non-anthropological studies, and maybe with what seemed to be the beginning of the rise of the new right-wing movements, the things that were being identified very much in terms of these are threats, these are the things that we have to build our borders against. And somehow I think there are certain bodies that lend themselves very easily to that kind of thing. And I think one's the migrant body, I think one's a sexualized body in a way that comes outside the idea of a heterosexual natural household. I think women's bodies are very easily essentialized that way, and I think there's a progressive from about that time, about 2010 onward, there's a progressive essentializing of particular kinds of bodies and a kind of demonizing of them, and that women becomes the key symbol of that, because the space of that demonization is what's seen as the proper space of the natural family within the state, where women's the center of the natural family, but sort of under the control of the state. And you've got the rise of a different kind of new patriarchy, I think. So I think that's the way that we can think about it. Why it happened is another thing altogether. I think there are lots of reasons, but somehow there's a really odd contradiction there between what gender and people working on gender were doing or trying to do, and how it got picked up and weaponized in this very different way. And I think that's one of the really frightening things about it.
Yeah, and if you take out of the context certain, quotes from gender scholars, like Judith Butler, but not only, also within anthropology, they could just mean something completely different if you decontextualize it.
Yeah.
I know, Agnieszka or Nicolette?
Same order?
Same. Okay. I just, in what you were just saying, I agree. We had this discussion over coffee this morning, by the way. So yeah, I think I really appreciate that you said gendered work, because I agree with you. I think there's an essentialization that's happened, an essentialization of bodies. And there's a parallel. I mean, I brought up these questions partly because I feel like, that also shows that there's also some sort of essentialization that happened within the theoretical work, not only out in society and definitely in politics, but also in parts of the theoretical realm or the academic realm, and this kind of essentialization that maybe gender is just about women, but not about relations and not about gendered work. It's not a process. It is something essential that either needs to be teased out or it needs to be defined, and then boundaries, in public and in political life, boundaries set up between desired bodies and desired performances.
And it's static.
Yeah, and that it's static. And I feel like, there is a parallel trajectory there, and actually saying that gendered is about work and process and relationships is something that we need to keep returning to, because the world, so to speak, out there in politics and in public is going increasingly in the opposite direction, that gender is about something essential, and that it's embodied and fixed, and then because of that there are outliers. But another thing about why it happened, I think our project called Gender Wars, East and South, it came out of discussions that we'd had with scholars of Latin America, who were facing much the same politics and discussions themselves. And one thing that I think both me and Agnieszka felt was that while the political side is quite well represented in academia, there's a lot of people looking at the intersection, the political language intersection of the rise of nationalist, homo-nationalist, right-wing politics and their use of gender or anti-gender discourses. There's much less focus on a kind of historical trajectory. So in those histories, the histories are often political histories about how political actors have mobilized these ideas, but less focus on, what are the essential connections that have been made? What is the religious institutions, religious histories? What has this meant for ideas of family over time, and all sorts of other things? And I think that was one thing we were trying to sort of bring out by bringing together this network of people to present also a different history and a different side of discussions around gender, that brought it out of political science, basically, and into anthropology, into history, into religious studies, other kinds of realms, and give those a bit more of a voice.
But I think within the project we saw it very clearly how, those local histories are really crucial, because on the one hand there is global populist movement attacking gender, but those things work differently in different contexts. So, and I think in this context, Francis' work on kinship is so important, because it shows that, for instance, in Eastern European and especially Polish context, all those discussions are at the end about the family and about the role of the family and the connection of the family with certain concept of Polishness. Mm-hmm. And then we could, I did it in my own work on sex education, so that you can track those conflicts way back to the early 20th century, when Poland didn't exist as an independent country, and there were all those discussions around pornography. And people would be saying, well, those pornographers, these are Russians or Germans who trying to destroy the Polish nation and the Polish family, making those poor Polish children be demoralized for pornography. So, and this argument keeps coming back through decade, year after year, and it was earlier in the context of sex education, and now there's supposed to be a new subject in Polish schools, health education, and it was also attacked with the same arguments of demoralizing the youth and destroying the family, and so you cannot, and then destroying the nation. So I think certain concepts here, but also similar in some Latin American contexts, would be really very strong, and this is why we really need more anthropological work, because anthropology is always about kinship and the family, right?
Can I come back to you?
Yeah.
I think that in Poland it's very stark often. I was really struck when with the women in black and all of the abortion thing and the absolute collision course between the church and the church faction, if you like, and just the strength of the church here and the strength of the women in black movement, and it made a huge impact, I think, internationally, but it's a very Polish context. But I think that what you're talking about, this idea that all of these things, which a kind of flexible idea about gender possibilities bring up, are threatening to the children, are threatening to families, are threatening to, that somehow these things that are seen as outside, and like almost, the language that's used for them is often a language of plague, and of surging, things surging in, things taking over, infection. And certainly in the UK, and certainly in the United States, you now have these incredibly strong sort of rural myths, urban myths about teachers who are deliberately undermining children at school and teaching them that they have gender dysphoria and that they need to have, that they need to think about transitioning, or they need to do that. And you have ideas about, that refugees come into the local community and they subvert the family, and they steal the women, or they rape the women, or they take away the resources that should be helping. So you've got all of these ways that the ideas about proper kinship, which is a very essentialized view of kinship also, is as being eroded by these, what they're seen as gender ideologies, which allow a kind of permissiveness.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think that really perhaps brings us to migration.
Always.
what Agnieszka is doing, right?
Yeah, so it's actually very hard to add to what you just said.
Okay.
So,
no pressure.
I'll try to stay on a more general note, and I've been thinking about how as anthropologists we can add to the understanding of these both gender wars or debates around gender, political mobilizations around the concept of gender these days, which are of course absolutely astonishing, and it's not like I cannot really provide an explanation as to why all of a sudden political debates are won and lost, and governments to be or not to be are sometimes about the issues of gender. But I think that as anthropologists we can add to a better understanding of this on two levels. Like on a theoretical level, we can divert this popular narrative that gender is and issues related to sexuality, to reproduction are some kind of substitute topics that we talk about instead of focusing on the important things like the economy or the state. But as anthropologists we understand that firstly these issues are extremely connected, and like how people feel that they are threatened on the level of gender, family, normal Polish family is largely related to these big economic questions. And then we also see that this is nothing new, and that gender is not a substitute topic, but rather something that has always been in the center of thinking about the state. Of course, this kind of derives from Michel Foucault's work on biopolitics and on how the modern nation state has always been somehow about controlling the reproduction of the population, about demography, about sexuality, about marriage and family, etc., etc. But also closer to home, of course, there's loads of work about the state and gender in Poland. like Agnieszka's work also, but also I think Agnieszka Graf and Elżbieta's work. So that's this theoretical level, and then I think on the ethnographic level we can also see beyond these mediatic discussions that tend to show things as binary, and we see that the ethnographic details that allows us to understand that actual people's perspective out there are actually very complex. And for instance, the main media show us a picture of Poland and the abortion debate, and it's Catholics who always think this, and then non-Catholics who always think this, and then we saw, for instance, devout Catholic women taking part in women's strikes, and we spoke to people whose perspectives on issues of abortion are actually very complex, very reflexive, and we see that outside of these public debates, there are much more complex things happening underneath.
Yeah, I think this is a very important point, showing us how strong possibly anthropological voice could be in the public debate, showing those tensions and showing those pro-choice Catholic women, for instance, in Poland. And then it's a totally new way of thinking about the politics and especially today in this really polarized society in Poland, but broadly. Do you want to add something?
No, I was just thinking when you were mentioning, the state and kind of biopolitics, and I don't know, you can hear. So I was just thinking about the case in Koniaków where I work, and this was one of the places that declared itself an anti-LGBTQ municipality. Lots of people being upset about sex education, and I spoke to people there, and the conversation ended up being about tolerance, and they were making various different arguments about tolerance, about their own tolerance, but also about needing to tolerate not just
Catholics.
Yeah, these were Catholics, but the area that Koniaków is in is a mixed area. So there's also Protestants, and it's the first 100% Catholic village, and all the other villages, going westwards are progressively more and more percentage of Protestants, and there is a self-perception as a very tolerant part, because there is multi-religious, kind of communities, and people have lived together for many hundreds of years, etc. But also what struck me was it wasn't just about that. The discussions seemed to be about, we have to tolerate the state. And so it's not just about how tolerant we are, but we also have to tolerate the messages that are coming from the state. If anyone has read Francis's work and some of my own work, the view of the state from the mountains in southern Poland is one of very great skepticism, and this seemed to be a kind of discourse where, again, that we have to tolerate the messages about tolerance coming from the state. However, we have our own ideas of what tolerance is, and I think this was really not the discussion that I thought I would be having. So I think the kind of embeddedness of these interpretations and the reasonings and ideas around gender is very, very, very important, that it is very localized and historical.
I was thinking a slightly different level, but when you were saying what can anthropology do, and I think that the kind of research that anthropologists have historically done, which is based so much on really, really fine-grained, detailed fieldwork, and fieldwork often over a long period of time, so you get a sense of what's changing on top, what's changing underneath, how they move together. I think that's one of the most important things. I think one of the most alarming things to me that's happening at the moment is the shifts in the kind of things that people are looking at in anthropology and in other social sciences, because people are worried about getting research funding, but they're also worried about whether it's possible to do research on these things anymore. What questions are maybe too worrying to ask, too dangerous to ask, that these are things that, I think that's very, very true in the States at the moment. I think it's becoming more true in the UK in a surprising way. I think it's probably true here, that things are seen as coming from both sides, from both sides of the debate or the war, if you like, that there are things that people who would say, well, we can't talk about those things anymore because, we'll be seen as this, that, or the other if we represent this point of view, even as anthropologists. And then on the other, so I think that there's an increasing limit on what's seen as proper research and on research that might possibly be funded.
And I think I just wanted to keep it for the end.
Okay.
But in this, what you are saying, I would like to say that in this very building, in October, there will be a new study program, which is MA in Gender Studies, here in this conservative Poland and at the University of Warsaw. So I think it's, I think it's not as bad everywhere, but who knows how long the program will survive. Yes, this is and it has this really very nice pink announcement, płci seksualność, with no gender in the title. It's only translating into English as sex and sexuality, but it means gender and sexuality.
I think two things, very, very shortly. I do believe that we can reclaim gender. And one of the reasons why we called the project Gender Wars, I mean, yes, it was, an easy way to grab the attention of the reviewers.
Yeah, and Hadley Rankin has always
Hadley has great titles up his sleeve. But also because, genuinely, this is a political moment where, this language is very strong. And if we do not engage, I think then we lose something there. What I wanted to say more in the UK, and I don't know if you agree, Francis, is the kind of the real key word is not so much gender, it's woman.
Yeah.
And what constitutes being a woman. And there was even a court ruling recently about, definition of what is a woman and what is not a woman legally. And this, of course, comes with trans debates and so on. So there the language is slightly different. There is also discussions around gender, and I've even seen, discussion forums online debating trans issues, and people coming in and saying, I don't have any gender, I'm just, I just go about my business, I'm an individual. A sort of general misunderstanding of kind of the social science understanding of what gender is,
Gender means trans in this.
Yes, because
transgender.
Because it's been hijacked to people think of gender as something again essentialized. That I don't go around thinking about being a woman all the time, and I'm like, well, that's not what how we think about gender, in social sciences, but that's how it is perceived, I think, by a lot of the public. But I just wanted to talk about how, the language is the same, but again, slightly different in different contexts, and why, for example, woman is now the kind of focal point of these discussions, I think is interesting.
I just wanted to add to this that I was thinking about this reclaiming gender, and I think it's very different for scholars in Poland and very different for scholars in the UK, because we operate in two languages, as we write both in Polish and English, but in the public debate we would obviously be in a completely different situation because we can avoid the word gender, or in many cases
like
use the word
płci seksualność.
Well, for you, you cannot escape the word gender if you want to relate to this entire debate. So it's a completely different process. And I think that for us, if we actually use the word gender, there's also this colonization by Western Europe sort of discourse that comes back at us. So I just think this is a very linguistically differentiated process.
So perhaps we lose the word, but we keep the
idea.
word.
Okay, so I think it's a great conclusion. And then against stereotypes, this all-female panel managed not to go over time. And we invite everybody to lunch, right?
Yes, I think a round of applause for the panel. Thank you very much.